Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the metal railing of the hospital bed, her knuckles turning white with each contraction. The harsh fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Medical Center cast unflattering shadows across her face, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes and the worry lines that had appeared far too early for her 23 years. The steady beeping of medical monitors created a haunting rhythm that seemed to mock the racing of her heart. "There's another one coming," Dr. Patricia Chen announced, her calm voice a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding in the delivery room. "And wait." She paused, studying the ultrasound screen with increased intensity. "Sarah, there's something you need to know." The words hung in the air like storm clouds, heavy with unspoken implications. Sarah's chest tightened, her breath catching in her throat. She had already been overwhelmed by the prospect of one baby, the thought that had driven James away 3 months ago, leaving nothing but a hastily scrawled note and an empty apartment. "You're carrying quadruplets." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sarah's vision blurred, the room spinning around her as the implications crashed over her like waves. 4 babies, 4 mouths to feed, 4 lives to shelter and protect. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. That's impossible," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the mechanical hum of medical equipment. "The previous ultrasounds are... Sometimes multiple pregnancies can be missed, especially if the babies are positioned in a way that makes it difficult to detect all of them," Dr. Chen explained, her eyes reflecting a mixture of professional concern and personal sympathy. "But right now we need to focus on delivery. You're about to become a mother of 4. The next few hours passed in a blur of pain, sweat, and tears. Sarah's screams echoed through the delivery room as she brought 4 tiny lives into the world, each cry piercing her heart like a needle. They were beautiful, 3 boys and a girl, all with varying shades of auburn hair that caught the light like copper wire. As she lay there, exhausted and empty, Sarah watched the nurses clean and away each baby. They were so small, so perfect, so utterly dependent. The reality of her situation crashed over her like a tidal wave. She was alone, working as a waitress at a diner that barely paid enough to cover her own expenses. Her parents had made it clear they wanted nothing to do with her mistake when she'd told them about the pregnancy. James was gone, leaving no forwarding address or contact information. The weight of impossibility settled over her like a heavy blanket. How could she possibly provide for 4 babies? How could she give them the life they deserved? The thought of watching them grow up in poverty, missing out on opportunities, feeling the sting of want and deprivation, it was unbearable. That night, as the hospital settled into its quiet rhythm and the baby slept in the nursery, Sarah made the hardest decision of her life. With trembling hands, she wrote 4 identical notes. "Please give them the life I cannot. I'm sorry." Her tears fell on the paper, smudging the ink. The next morning, she signed the paperwork for voluntary surrender, her signature wobbling on each line. She couldn't bear to look at the babies one last time, knowing it would shatter her resolve. Instead, she walked out of the hospital with empty arms and a heart so heavy it felt like it would drag her through the floor. The babies, unaware of the profound decision that had just altered the course of their lives, were soon separated. The oldest, named Michael by his adoptive parents, was taken in by the Andersons, a wealthy family from the suburbs of Boston. The second boy, whom the Martins named William, found a home with a middle-class family in Connecticut. The youngest boy and the girl, twins Thomas and Emma, remained in the hospital's care longer before being transferred to Hope's Haven Children's Home. Sarah returned to her tiny apartment, the silence deafening after the chaos of the hospital. She moved mechanically through the days that followed, her body going through the motions while her mind remained trapped in that hospital room. Every baby she saw on the street made her heart clench. Every auburn-haired child caused her breath to catch. She threw herself into work, picking up extra shifts at the diner and starting a night job cleaning offices. The physical exhaustion helped quiet the constant chorus of guilt and regret that played in her mind. She started taking online classes, determined to build a better life, if not for her children, then in their honor. Years passed and the babies grew into distinct individuals, shaped by their different environments. Michael Anderson thrived in his privileged world of private schools and summer camps, though the pressure to excel weighed heavily on his young shoulders. His adoptive parents, Richard and Catherine Anderson, had great expectations for their only son, seeing him as the heir to their financial empire. William Martin found his place in a home filled with books and intellectual discussions. His adoptive parents, both professors at a small liberal arts college, fostered his natural curiosity and love of learning. They created a structured but nurturing environment where questions were encouraged and knowledge was prized above material success. Thomas and Emma faced a different path. After 6 months in Hope's Haven, they were adopted together by the Reyes family, a warm-hearted couple who had already adopted 3 other children. Their home was modest but filled with love, laughter, and the controlled chaos that came with a large family. Despite their different circumstances, all 4 children shared an inexplicable sense of incompleteness. Michael would sometimes stand at his bedroom window, staring at the stars with an overwhelming feeling that something or someone was missing from his life. William found himself drawn to crowds, scanning faces with an urgency he couldn't explain. Emma would wake from dreams of 3 boys with familiar eyes, their features just beyond the reach of memory. Thomas collected family photographs obsessively, as if trying to piece together a puzzle he didn't know existed. As they approached their 10th birthday, though none knew they shared the same one, the threads of fate began to draw tighter. Catherine Anderson's company opened a new office in Hartford, prompting the family's move from Boston. The Martins received tenure offers from a university in the same city. The Reyes family, seeking better opportunities for their growing brood, relocated to Hartford's diverse suburbs. The city of Hartford became the stage for an extraordinary reunion, though none of the players yet knew their parts. The children were enrolled in Hartford Academy, a well-regarded private school that offered scholarships to promising students from diverse backgrounds. The stage was set for a discovery that would shake the foundations of 4 families and rebuild the bridges that had been broken on that fateful night in the hospital. William was the first to notice something odd. Sitting in his new 6th grade classroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that the boy across the aisle, Michael Anderson, looked eerily familiar. It wasn't just a passing resemblance. It was like looking at a slightly different version of himself. The same auburn hair, the same angle of the jaw, even the same habit of tapping his pencil against his teeth when concentrating. During lunch period, William found himself studying Michael from across the cafeteria. His attention was so focused that he almost didn't notice when someone bumped into his table, causing his milk carton to topple. A girl with the same auburn hair quickly reached out to catch it. "Sorry," Emma exclaimed, her quick reflexes preventing a spill. "I wasn't watching where I was going." She looked up, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. William stared into eyes that mirrored his own, the same unusual shade of hazel with flecks of gold. Behind Emma, her brother Thomas stood rooted to the spot, his lunch tray forgotten in his hands. The 4 children stood in a loose circle, each studying the others with a mixture of confusion and growing recognition. It was like looking into a series of mirrors, each reflecting back familiar features in slightly different arrangements. The busy cafeteria faded into background noise as they grappled with the impossible coincidence before them. Emma, always, the most direct, broke the silence. "Okay, this is weird, right? We all look like we could be related." Michael, trained by his adoptive parents to maintain composure in any situation, tried to dismiss the notion. "Lots of people have auburn hair and similar features. It's probably just a coincidence." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they rang hollow. This was more than a superficial resemblance. There was something deeper, something that resonated in his bones and whispered of shared blood and common origins. William, his academic mind already racing through possibilities, spoke up. "I'm adopted," he said quietly, watching their reactions carefully. "Are any of you?" The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas and Emma exchanged glances, a wordless conversation passing between them. Michael's carefully maintained facade cracked slightly, his eyes widening with recognition and possibility. "We need to talk," Emma declared, glancing around the crowded cafeteria. "But not here. Meet me at the library after school, the one on Maple Street, not the school library." As they separated to return to their respective classes, each felt the weight of discovery settling over them. They had stumbled upon something extraordinary, something that would change their lives forever. What they didn't know was that across town, in a small apartment above a bookstore, Sarah was looking at a photograph of herself at their age, marveling at how much she looked like the children she sometimes glimpsed in her dreams. That same afternoon, as autumn leaves skittered across the sidewalk outside the Maple Street Library, Sarah's fingers traced the edges of the old photograph. She had been cleaning out her closet when she found it tucked away in a dusty shoebox, along with other remnants of her past life. The resemblance was uncanny. The same auburn hair that her children had inherited, the same determined set of the jaw. She wondered, as she had countless times before, what they looked like now. Would they have her height? Their father's smile? The thought sent a familiar ache through her chest. The sound of young voices outside the bookstore drew her attention to the window. She watched as a group of middle school students passed by, their backpacks bouncing with each step. For a moment, her heart stopped. Among them was a girl with auburn hair that caught the sunlight exactly as hers did. Sarah pressed her hand against the glass, her breath fogging the pain. But no, this wasn't one of her children. This girl was too young, her features different enough to break the spell of possibility. Meanwhile, inside the library, 4 children who were very much hers gathered around a secluded table in the reference section. The afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across opened yearbooks, and family photographs spread between them. Emma had brought a recent family portrait, while William contributed a baby picture his parents had given him. Michael, despite his initial reluctance, shared a school photo from the previous year. Thomas added several snapshots from the Reyes family album. "Look at this," William said, his voice barely above a whisper as he arranged the photos, side by side. "The similarity is undeniable. We all have the same hair color, the same eye shape, even the same chin." Emma leaned forward, her finger tracing the outline of each face in turn. "And we're all adopted. That can't be a coincidence." She paused, glancing at Michael. "You are adopted, right? You never actually confirmed it." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his usually confident demeanor cracking slightly. "Yes," he admitted finally, "though my parents don't like to talk about it. They prefer to pretend I'm their biological son." He straightened his private school blazer, a nervous habit he'd developed over years of trying to live up to the Anderson name. "I only found out by accident last year when I overheard them discussing my adoption records with their lawyer. Our parents have always been open about it," Thomas said, gesturing to himself and Emma. "They believe in honesty about adoption. They even helped us try to find information about our birth parents, but the records were sealed." William pulled out a notebook, his methodical mind already organizing the facts. "Okay, let's list what we know. We're all adopted. We all look remarkably similar. We're all the same age." As he looked up. "When's your birthday?" The answer came in unison. October 15th. The silence that followed was electric. Even Michael, who had been maintaining his skepticism as a shield against hope, felt it crack completely. They stared at each other, 4 pairs of identical hazel eyes wide with the implications of their discovery. "We're quadruplets," Emma breathed, giving voice to what they all now suspected. "We were separated at birth." Thomas reached for his sister's hand, no, his twin's hand, under the table. They had always felt a special connection, beyond just being adopted siblings. Now they knew why. "But why would they separate us?" he wondered aloud. "Why wouldn't they keep us all together?" "Resources, probably," William theorized, his academic mind already analyzing the logistics. Finding one family willing and able to adopt 4 babies at once would be extremely difficult. It's more practical to separate them to ensure they all find homes. Michael's face darkened. "Practical," he echoed, an edge of anger in his voice. "There's nothing practical about tearing apart a family, about keeping siblings, twins, from knowing each other exists." His hands clenched into fists on the table, knuckles white with suppressed emotion. Emma reached across the table, her fingers brushing against Michael's tense hand. The contact seemed to startle him, and he looked up to meet her gaze. In that moment, something passed between them, a recognition, a connection that transcended their years of separation. "We know now," she said softly. "That's what matters, we found each other. But there's still so much we don't know," William pointed out, ever the logical one. "Who are our birth parents? Why did they give us up? Do they ever think about us?" "We need to find out," Thomas declared, his usual quiet demeanor giving way to determination. "We have a right to know our own story." The library's overhead lights flickered on as dusk approached, startling the four of them out of their intense discussion. They had been there for hours, piecing together their shared history, comparing notes about their lives, discovering the countless small similarities that went beyond mere appearance. They all loved strawberry ice cream. They all had an inexplicable fear of thunderstorms. They all played with their hair when deep in thought, a habit they had each been teased about by their respective families. "We should meet again tomorrow," Emma suggested, gathering her photographs. "And we should each try to find out more information from our parents. Maybe if we combine what we learn—" "My parents won't tell me anything," Michael said flatly. "They've made it clear that discussing my adoption is off limits." "Then we'll have to find another way," William replied, already formulating plans. "Every puzzle has a solution. We just need to find the right pieces." As they packed up their things, Emma suddenly stopped. "Wait, we need a way to stay in touch. We can't just rely on seeing each other at school." She tore a page from William's notebook and quickly wrote down her phone number. "Here, we should all exchange numbers, and maybe we could create a group chat." The others followed suit, each adding their contact information to the page before carefully tearing it into 4 pieces. As they exchanged the scraps of paper, their fingers brushed against each other, small touches that sent shivers of recognition through each of them, as if their very cells remembered their shared beginning. Outside the library, the autumn. Wind had picked up, sending leaves swirling around their feet. The four of them stood in a tight circle, reluctant to part ways now that they had found each other. The streetlights were beginning to come on, casting pools of golden light on the sidewalk. "This feels surreal," Thomas said, voicing what they were all thinking. "This morning we were strangers, and now we're family," Emma finished, her voice firm with conviction. "Real family." Michael looked at his watch, an expensive gift from his adoptive parents, and sighed. "I have to go. My driver's probably wondering where I am." He hesitated, then added, "But I'll see you all tomorrow." The question in his voice was unmistakable, a need for reassurance that this wasn't a dream, that they wouldn't disappear. Once he turned his back. William nodded firmly. "Tomorrow," he confirmed. "We'll figure this out together." As they separated, heading in different directions under the darkening sky, each felt the pull of their newfound connection like a physical force. Emma and Thomas walked home together, their shoulders brushing, lost in thought about how their family of 5 had suddenly expanded. William headed toward the bus stop, his mind racing with possibilities and plans. Michael climbed into the waiting black SUV, for once not caring about maintaining the perfect posture his parents insisted upon. None of them noticed the woman watching from the bookstore window above, her hand pressed against the glass, her eyes following their departing figures with a mixture of longing and fear. Sarah had seen them gather, had watched them compare their features and photographs, had witnessed the moment of recognition. She knew with a certainty that made her heart race that her carefully constructed walls were about to come crashing down. In her apartment, Sarah moved away from the window and sank into her worn armchair. Her hands shook as she reached for the phone, dialing a number she had memorized years ago but never had the courage to call. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Hope's Haven Children's Home, this is Margaret speaking." Sarah took a deep breath, steadying her voice. "Hello, Margaret. My name is Sarah Collins. 14 years ago, I gave birth to quadruplets at St. Mary's Medical Center." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sarah could hear papers rustling and the distant sound of children's voices in the background. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she waited, each second stretching into eternity. "Miss Collins," Margaret finally spoke, her voice carefully neutral. "Yes, I remember your case. It's not every day we handle quadruplets." Another pause. "May I ask why you're calling after all these years?" Sarah's fingers tightened around the phone. Through her window, she could still see the spot where her children had stood moments ago, now empty under the glow of streetlights. "They've found each other," she said softly. "I just saw them together at the library." "They know they're quadruplets, Margaret. They're going to start asking questions." "I see." Margaret's professional demeanor cracked slightly, revealing genuine concern. "You understand that I can't disclose any information about their adoptive families. Those records are sealed." "I'm not asking you to break any laws," Sarah assured her quickly. I need to know what to do. They're going to want answers. They're going to want to know why I gave them up. I've spent 14 years trying to make myself worthy of them, and now—" her voice broke. "Now I don't know if I'm ready to face them." Meanwhile, across town, Michael Anderson sat in his family's formal dining room, pushing his organic salmon around his plate with a silver fork. The chandelier above cast crystal shadows across the mahogany table as his parents discussed their days in measured tones, maintaining the carefully choreographed routine of their evening meal. "Michael, darling, you're unusually quiet tonight," Catherine Anderson observed, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her wine glass. "Did something happen at school?" Michael looked up, meeting his mother's questioning gaze. In her tailored business suit and expertly styled hair, she was the picture of corporate success, everything she wanted him to become. How could he tell her that his whole world had shifted on its axis today, that the carefully constructed image of the Anderson heir had been shattered by 3 faces that mirrored his own? "I met some interesting new students today," he said, carefully testing the waters. "One of them reminded me of someone." Richard Anderson barely looked up from his BlackBerry. "That's nice, son. Speaking of school, don't forget you have that mock trial competition this weekend. The Petersons will be there, and their son is your main competition for top honors." Michael felt the familiar weight of expectation settle on his shoulders, but for the first time it didn't seem as important. Somewhere in Hartford, his real siblings were sitting down to their own dinners, living their own lives. William was probably discussing literature with his professor parents. Emma and Thomas might be laughing around a crowded table with their adoptive siblings. The contrast with his own sterile dining room was stark. Across the city, in the Martin household, William was having a very different evening. Books were scattered across the kitchen table, sharing space with dinner plates as his parents engaged in an animated discussion about their latest research projects. The atmosphere was warm, intellectual, and usually exactly what William loved. Tonight, though, he could barely focus on the conversation. "Mom, Dad," he interrupted during a pause in their discussion about medieval literature. "What do you know about my adoption?" Rebecca and James Martin exchanged glances. "We've always been open with you about that, honey," Rebecca said gently. "You know we adopted you through St. Mary's Medical Center when you were a newborn." "Why do you ask?" William chose his next words carefully. "Did you know I was one of quadruplets?" The clatter of his father's fork against his plate echoed in the sudden silence. James removed his reading glasses, cleaning them with his napkin, a nervous habit William had seen countless times during difficult faculty meetings. "Where did you hear that?" "I met them today," William replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "The other 3. We're all at Hartford Academy. Now we share the same birthday, the same features, the same mannerisms." He pulled out his phone, showing them the photos they had taken at the library. "Look at us, you can't deny the resemblance." In the Reyes household, chaos reigned as it did every evening. Emma and Thomas sat among their adoptive siblings at the large scratched kitchen table, the air filled with overlapping conversations in English and Spanish, requests to pass dishes, and the general din of a large family at dinner. But tonight, they were unusually quiet, their silence noticed by their perceptive adoptive mother. "¿Qué pasa, mis amores?" Elena Reyes asked, her dark eyes warm with concern. "You've barely touched your enchiladas." Emma glanced at Thomas, receiving a slight nod. They had always been able to communicate without words, a connection that now made perfect sense. "Mama, Papa," she began, "we need to tell you something. We met our brothers today." The bustling kitchen fell silent. Their adoptive siblings, two older, one younger, stopped their conversations to listen. Carlos Reyes set down his fork, giving them his full attention. "Your brothers?" he asked carefully. "We're quadruplets," Thomas explained, his quiet voice carrying in the silence. "Two others. They go to school with us now. We found each other today." Eleanor pressed a hand to her heart, tears welling in her eyes. "Dios mío," she whispered. "We knew you were part of a multiple birth, but the agency told us the others had been adopted immediately at the hospital. We tried to get information, but everything was sealed." Back in her apartment, Sarah was still on the phone with Margaret, who had softened her professional tone as their conversation continued. "The children have a right to know their history," Margaret was saying, "but they also have a right to process this at their own pace. If they start asking questions at Hope's Haven, we'll have protocols to follow, but Sarah—" She paused meaningfully. "Are you ready to be found?" Sarah stood up, walking to her desk where she kept her most precious possessions. She pulled out a worn envelope, carefully opening it to reveal 4 tiny hospital bracelets, saved from that night 14 years ago. "I've spent every day since. I left that hospital trying to become someone worthy of being their mother," she said, her voice stronger now. "I got my GED, then my bachelor's degree. I opened this bookstore. I've built a life that could include them if they want me in it." She touched one of the bracelets gently. "I'm not that scared young woman anymore." "No," Margaret agreed softly. "You're not, but this won't be easy. These children have lived 14 years with their adoptive families. They have their own lives, their own support systems, and they may be angry." "I know," Sarah acknowledged. "I've played this moment out in my head thousands of times. Sometimes they forgive me instantly. Sometimes they hate me forever. The reality will probably be somewhere in between." She looked out her window again, where the street was now empty, except for fallen leaves dancing in the autumn wind. "But they deserve to know their story. They deserve to know they weren't abandoned out of indifference or lack of love." As night fell over Hartford, 4 children lay awake in their beds, their minds racing with the day's discoveries. In his elaborate 4-poster bed, Michael stared at the phone number Emma had given him, wondering if his siblings were awake too. In his room lined with bookshelves, William made lists of questions and possible research approaches. In their modest shared bedroom, Emma and Thomas whispered late into the night, planning their next steps. And in her apartment above the bookstore, Sarah Collins finally allowed herself to cry, not tears of regret or sadness, but tears of hope and fear and possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries, and perhaps the beginning of healing wounds she had carried for 14 years. But for now she held the tiny hospital bracelets close to her heart and whispered into the darkness, "I never stopped loving you. I hope someday you'll understand." The city settled into its nighttime rhythm, unaware that within its bounds a story 14 years in the making was finally beginning to unfold. The bonds of blood, stretched thin but never broken, were pulling 4 siblings together, drawing them inexorably toward a truth that would change all their lives forever. And somewhere between them all, a mother waited, hoping that the love she had carried silently for so long would be enough to bridge the chasm of years and choices that separated her from her children. Dawn broke over Hartford with a gentle mist, wrapping the city's buildings in a soft grey embrace. Sarah had barely slept, spending most of the night organizing the box of memories she'd kept hidden for 14 years. Besides the hospital bracelets, there were ultrasound photos, the first and only pictures she had of her children together, and a journal she'd started writing the day she discovered she was pregnant. Each entry was addressed to them, her hopes, her fears, her reasons, her regrets. She'd never stopped writing, filling journal after journal with the words she couldn't say in person. The bookstore wouldn't open for several hours, but Sarah was already downstairs, methodically organizing shelves to keep her hands busy. The morning light filtered through the large front windows, catching dust motes in its beam. She paused at the young adult section, her fingers trailing along the Spines of books about identity, family, and self-discovery. How many times had she imagined her children reading these same stories, wondering about their own origins? The sharp trill of her phone startled her from her reverie. It was Margaret from Hope's Haven. "Sarah, I thought you should know. 2 of the children came to the home this morning. They're asking questions." Sarah's hand gripped the bookshelf for support. "Which ones?" "Emma and Thomas Reyes. They're very determined, Sarah. Very intelligent. They're not leaving without answers." Across town, Emma and Thomas sat in Margaret's office, their school backpacks at their feet. They had left early, telling their parents they needed to work on a project before classes. Elena had given them a knowing look, but hadn't stopped them. Instead, she'd pressed extra breakfast burritos into their hands and whispered, "Follow your hearts, Miss Amoris. We understand you can't give us specific information about our adoption," Emma was saying, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "But there must be something you can tell us. Anything about our birth mother, why she gave us up?" Margaret studied the 2 teenagers before her. They had their mother's determination. That much was clear. "What I can tell you is that your birth mother made her decision out of love," she said carefully. "She was very young, alone, and facing an impossible situation. She wanted to give you your best chance." "All 4 of us?" Thomas asked quietly. "She gave up all 4 of us at once?" Margaret nodded. "It's unusual for quadruplets to be separated, but in this case it was deemed the best option for ensuring all of you found stable homes quickly." Meanwhile, William had arrived early, at school making his way to the library. His adoptive parents' reaction the night before had been supportive but concerned. They'd spent hours talking, sharing what little they knew about his adoption. One detail had caught his attention, the name of the lawyer who had handled the paperwork. Now, seated at a library computer, William carefully typed the name into the search bar. Jonathan Pierce Family Law. The result showed a small practice in downtown Hartford, still active after all these years. His heart quickened as he noted the address, just a few blocks from the school. The soft sound of expensive leather shoes on carpet made him look up. Michael stood there, his private school uniform impeccable as always, but his usual confident demeanor showed cracks. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd slept as poorly as the rest of them. "I asked my driver to drop me off early," Michael explained, sliding into the chair next to William. "I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about everything." He pulled out his phone, showing William a screen full of text messages. "I've been talking with Emma and Thomas all night. They're at Hope's Haven right now, trying to get information." William nodded, turning his laptop screen so Michael could see. "I think I found something too. The lawyer who handled my adoption, he's still practicing here in Hartford. His office opens in an hour." Michael's eyes widened slightly. "You want to go there? Now? Don't you want answers?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Michael ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up in a way that would have horrified his mother. "My parents would kill me if they knew I was investigating this. They've made it very clear that my adoption is a closed subject." "They're not your only family anymore," William pointed out softly. The words hit Michael like a physical force. He sat back in his chair, processing their truth. All his life he'd tried to be the perfect Anderson heir, suppressing any questions about his origins to maintain his parents' approval. But now there were other people to consider, siblings who shared his blood, his features, his birthday. Siblings who were actively searching for answers. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's do it. We can skip first period. I'll text Emma and Thomas to meet us there." Across town in her bookstore, Sarah was making a similar decision. After ending her call with Margaret, she'd stood frozen among her beloved books, weighing her options. She could wait, let the children find their way to her gradually. Or she could take control of the narrative, meet them on her own terms. With trembling fingers, she dialed another number, one she'd found years ago but never used. "Pierce Law Offices," a cheerful receptionist answered. "Yes, I need to speak with Jonathan Pierce. It's about an adoption he handled 14 years. Quadruplets." There was a pause, then, "One moment, please." As she waited, Sarah moved to the window, looking out at the street beginning to fill with morning commuters. Somewhere out there, her children were searching for answers. They were brave enough to ask the questions. She needed to be brave enough to provide the answers. "Mrs. Collins," a male voice came on the line. "This is Jonathan Pierce. I remember your case very well. In fact, I've been expecting your call." Sarah's breath caught. "You have?" "Yes. 2 of the adoptive families contacted me last night. The children have found each other, haven't they?" "Yes," Sarah whispered. "They have." "Then I think it's time we had a meeting. There are things about their adoption, about why they were separated, that they need to know, things that weren't just about your decision." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" "It would be better to discuss this in person. Can you come to my office this morning?" Sarah glanced at the clock. The bookstore was supposed to open in 30 minutes, but some things were more important than business hours. "I'll be there in an hour." As she hung up the phone, Sarah noticed movement outside her window. 4 teenagers were walking past the bookstore, heads bent together in serious discussion. The morning sun caught their auburn hair, making it glow like burnished copper. Her heart stopped for a moment as she recognized them, not from their features, which she had memorized from afar, but from the way they moved together already, falling into the rhythms of siblings despite their years apart. They were heading in the direction of Pierce's office. Sarah watched until they disappeared around the corner, then moved quickly to gather her things. The journals, the hospital bracelets, the ultrasound photos, she packed them all into her worn leather bag. Whatever Jonathan Pierce needed to tell them, whatever secrets still remained to be revealed, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Today was the day everything would change. The morning mist was beginning to burn away as she locked the bookstore door, leaving a hastily written "Closed for Family Emergency" sign in the window. The irony of those words wasn't lost on her as she began walking toward downtown Hartford, her footsteps echoing in the same path her children had just taken. Above her, the sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows that seemed to point the way toward a future that was finally, after 14 years, about to begin. The elevator in the Pierce Law Building hummed softly as it carried Sarah to the 4th floor. Her reflection in the polished brass doors showed a woman she barely recognized, someone stronger than the terrified girl who had left her babies 14 years ago, yet somehow more vulnerable than she'd felt in years. The leather bag containing her journals and mementos felt heavy against her shoulder, weighted with years of unspoken words and untold truths. The doors opened to reveal a tastefully appointed law office. Muted beige walls displayed framed law degrees and professional certificates, while potted plants added strategic touches of life to the corporate environment. Behind the reception desk, a young woman looked up with a practiced smile. "Mrs. Collins, Mr. Pierce is expecting you." However, the receptionist's smile faltered slightly. "There seems to be a situation. 4 teenagers arrived about 10 minutes ago, rather insistent about seeing Mr. Pierce. They claim it's about an adoption case." Sarah's heart stuttered in her chest. Of course they would come here. They were her children, after all, with her determination running through their veins. "Are they still here?" "Mr. Pierce asked them to wait in the conference room." The receptionist gestured down a hallway to the right. "He wanted to speak with you first, but they're being quite persistent." From somewhere down the hall, Sarah could hear muffled voices, young, intense, familiar even though she'd never heard them before. She found herself moving toward the sound before she could stop herself, drawn by an instinct that had never truly faded. "Mrs. Collins, wait!" the receptionist called after her. "Mr. Pierce wanted—" But Sarah was already moving down the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She passed framed photographs of Hartford's skyline, her reflection fragmenting and reforming in each glass surface. The voices grew clearer as she approached a partially open door. "We have a right to know," a girl's voice was saying. "Emma, it had to be Emma. These files are about us, about our lives." "The receptionist said we need to wait for the lawyer," another voice responded. William, measured and logical even, in frustration. "There must be legal protocols." "Protocols?" That would be Michael, his cultured accent carrying traces of barely contained emotion. "We've waited 14 years. How much longer are we supposed to wait?" "Guys," Thomas's quieter voice cut through the others. "Someone's coming." Sarah stood frozen outside the door, her hand halfway raised to push it open. 14 years of imagination hadn't prepared her for this moment. What would they see when they looked at her? The mother who abandoned them, a stranger, a disappointment. The choice was taken from her as the door swung open fully, revealing Jonathan Pierce himself. He was older than she remembered, his hair more grey than black now, lines carved deeper around his eyes, but his expression was the same mix of compassion and professional distance she remembered from that night at the hospital. "Sarah," he said softly, then turned to the room's other occupants. "Children, I believe there's someone you should meet." The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah found herself looking into 4 pairs of eyes, identical to her own, set in faces that echoed her younger self. They had James's nose, she noticed distantly, and something of her father's chin. But the way they held themselves, Emma's slight forward lean, William's analytical gaze, Michael's carefully controlled posture, Thomas's quiet watchfulness, that was all their own. Emma was the first to break the silence. "You're her, aren't you?" Her voice trembled slightly. "You're our mother." Sarah's throat tightened. All the carefully prepared speeches, all the explanations she'd rehearsed over the years, vanished like smoke. "Yes," she managed. "I am." Michael stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Why?" The single word carried 14 years of questions, of wondering, of trying to be perfect enough to prevent being abandoned again. "Perhaps we should all sit down," Pierce suggested, gesturing to the large conference table. "There's a great deal to discuss, and some of it may be unexpected." Sarah moved to the table on shaking legs, setting her bag down carefully. The journals inside seemed to pulse with the weight of their contents. Years of one-sided conversations she'd had with these children who now sat before her as strangers. "First," Pierce said, opening a thick file folder, "there's something you all need to understand. The decision to separate you wasn't solely your mother's choice. There were other factors, other people involved." "What do you mean?" William leaned forward, his analytical mind already working on this new puzzle. "Who else would have had a say?" Pierce glanced at Sarah, who nodded slightly. It was time for all the truth to come out. "Your father's family," Pierce said carefully. "The Blackwoods." Michael's head snapped up. "Blackwood, as in Blackwood Industries?" "Yes." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "James Blackwood Jr. was your father. When his family found out about the pregnancy, they had very specific ideas about how it should be handled." The revelation hung in the air like a thundercloud. Blackwood Industries was one of the largest corporations in New England, old money mixed with new technology. Their name was on buildings, on charitable foundations, on the very fabric of Hartford's business world. "They didn't want a scandal," Thomas said quietly, understanding dawning in his eyes. 4 illegitimate children would have been a threat to their reputation, Pierce confirmed, and potentially to their inheritance structure. James Jr. was heir to the company at the time. His father, your grandfather, was very concerned about potential claims on the family fortune. Emma's hand found Thomas's under the table, squeezing tightly. "So they forced you to give us up?" Sarah opened her bag with trembling fingers, pulling out the oldest of her journals. "They gave me a choice that wasn't really a choice. If I kept you, they would use their influence to make sure I lost custody anyway. No judge in Hartford would have ruled against the Blackwoods. They said," she swallowed hard, "they said at least this way I could make sure you went to good homes instead of being lost in the system." The separations were part of their conditions, Pierce added. They wanted to minimize the chance of you finding each other, of the story coming out. Each adoption was handled through a different agency, different courts. The paperwork was deliberately complicated, the records sealed under multiple jurisdictions. "But why come forward now?" Michael demanded, his voice sharp with emotion. "After all these years?" Sarah opened the journal to its first page, where her younger self had poured out her heart in trembling handwriting. "Because I never stopped thinking about you, never stopped loving you. I wrote to you every day, hoping that someday I'd be strong enough, established enough to find you and tell you the truth." She pushed the journal forward slightly. "Everything is in here, everything I wished I could tell you as you grew up." William reached for the journal with careful hands, his academic's reverence for written words evident in his touch. "You wrote to us?" "I have 14 years of journals," Sarah said softly, "one for each year I missed. Everything I wanted to share with you, every milestone I imagined you reaching, every dream I had for your futures." Emma was crying silently now, tears tracking down her cheeks. Thomas had his arm around her shoulders, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Michael stood by the window, his back rigid, while William carefully turned the pages of the journal. "There's more," Pierce said, drawing their attention back to the matter at hand. James Jr. passed away last month. The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. Despite everything, despite his abandonment and his family's cruel manipulation, a part of her had never stopped loving the young man who had shared her dreams for a brief, beautiful moment. "His father, your grandfather, is dying," Pierce continued. "Cancer. He's not expected to live out the year. In his last lucid moments he expressed regret about how things were handled. He wanted to make amends." "Amends?" Michael's laugh was bitter. "After 14 years? He's changed his will." Pierce pulled out another document. "You're all in it. Equal shares, along with your cousin who's been running the company since James Jr.'s death. He wants you to know your heritage, to have what should have been yours all along." The implications of this announcement rippled through the room. William set down the journal, his mind visibly racing with calculations. Emma and Thomas exchanged loaded glances, while Michael remained statue still by the window. "We don't want their money," Emma said firmly. "We want answers. We want—" She looked at Sarah, really looked at her, seeing past the initial shock of recognition to the woman who had carried them, who had written to them every day for 14 years, who had made an impossible choice out of love. "We want to know our mother." Sarah's heart swelled with a hope so intense it was almost painful. "I'd like that," she whispered, "more than anything." "It won't be simple," Pierce cautioned. "The Blackwood inheritance will come with complications, responsibilities, and your adoptive family are still our families," Thomas completed. "This doesn't change that. But maybe—" He glanced around at his siblings, then at Sarah. "Maybe our families can grow." Michael finally turned from the window. In the morning light, his features were softer, more vulnerable. "I want to read the journals," he said suddenly. "All of them. I want to understand." Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out another volume, then another. "They're all here," she said. "Every word I wished I could say to you, every story I wished I could tell, everything I hoped you'd understand someday." The 5 of them sat there in the growing morning light, surrounded by papers that detailed their separation and journals that chronicled their mother's enduring love. Outside Pierce's window, Hartford continued its busy morning rhythm, unaware that within these walls, a family fractured by power and privilege was taking its first tentative steps toward healing. Pierce quietly excused himself, leaving them alone with their discoveries. Emma moved first, sliding her chair closer to Sarah's. "Tell us," she said softly. "Tell us everything. Start at the beginning." Sarah opened the first journal, her fingers tracing words written 14 years ago with tears and hope. "I was 23, she began, "working as a waitress and taking night classes when I met your father. He was different then, kinder, with dreams of his own beyond the family business." As she spoke, her children drew closer, drawn in by the story of their beginning. It wasn't a fairy tale, it was messier, more complicated, shot through with pain and loss and impossible choices. But it was their story, and for the first time, they were hearing it together.